The subcommittee will come to order. Good morning, and thank you for being here. Before I begin introducing our witnesses and doing opening statements this morning, I want to dispense with some of the unanimous consent requests. I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Is there any objection? Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that written testimony submitted on behalf of the following be included in this hearing's record: from the Association of State Floodplain Managers, from Trout Unlimited, including attached report prepared for Building America Investment Initiative, from Food and Water Watch, from the National Rural Water Association, 3 articles from Peter Gaelic, from American Rivers, from the Bay Planning Coalition, a publication from the American Geophysical Union, and a resolution from the Subcommittee on Sedimentation, a subgroup of the Advisory Committee on Water Information. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 30 days after this hearing in order to accept written testimony for the hearing record. Without objection, so ordered. And finally, ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you very much again for being here today, and looking forward to hearing from our diverse witness panel today. The impetus for this hearing was thinking about the fact that there's been a lot of talk about a major infrastructure package, about the talk of investment of $1 trillion in addressing some of America's infrastructure needs. If we're, say, a year out from moving forward on that implementation, what are some of the things that we should be thinking about right now? What are some of the obstacles to efficiently delivering infrastructure? What are some of the impediments or opportunities to improve our ability to quickly get these projects on the ground? And that's what we're doing here today. We brought, again, a diverse panel of witnesses to come provide to us their insight and thoughts on some of the things that we could be doing to help improve this process. In the short time that we've been named subcommittee chair, we have met with dozens and dozens of non-federal sponsors, of local governments, of state governments, and other organizations from across the country, raising strong concerns about regulations and permitting processes that are in place that simply do not provide value. And I want to be clear. The need for regulations that ensure the protection of our environment, that should ensure the protection of the health and safety of Americans, things that look to make sure the efficacy of investments, the cost-to-benefit ratios, are all things that make a lot of sense. But in many cases, we have found regulations or solutions in search of problems, and that raises strong concern. So again, looking forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and with that, I'm going to turn to the ranking member, Ms. Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to as the new chairman to Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment. Mr. Chairman, when you and I met just over a month ago to discuss a potential agenda for Congress, I suggested we start those areas where we could find common ground. The subcommittee is most successful when we work together in a bipartisan fashion to rebuild our nation's crumbling infrastructure and prepare our communities for challenges they'll face in decades to come. Without question, this nation is witnessing a changing water-related environment, and those changes are having a profound implication on our local communities, our natural environment, and our overall way of life. Ironically, our respective districts are facing very different challenges, yours with too much water and mine too often too little. But the reality is that both districts must adapt and adequately prepare for what lies ahead. I am pleased that our first hearing focuses on an area that we should find common ground, the need for increased investment in our nation's water-related infrastructure, especially federal investment. We all know that the challenges facing our communities are in addressing the local water resources needs and adapting to a changing world. Whether the issue is crumbling dams and levees, outdated sewers and stormwater conveyances, inefficient navigation corridors, or large-scale ecosystem restoration authorities, I am certain that every member in this room can point to a water-related challenge facing their constituents at home. Yet, if your elected officials are like mine, the central theme in meeting these challenges is the help needed for additional funding. As former chief of engineers once noted before the subcommittee, By failing to efficiently fund projects, we ultimately fail the American taxpayer by delaying the realization of project benefits and by unnecessarily increasing costs due to these delays. Similarly, when we fail to provide the necessary resources to invest in, update, and adequately maintain our infrastructure, we should not be surprised when systems fail, when communities are placed at risk and the cost begins to become greater, and when our state and local economies underperform. My communities want to do the right thing. They want to provide our citizens with safe, reliable, affordable water and wastewater services, but they cannot do it alone. They're calling on us in Congress to renew the federal commitment to our water-related infrastructure. I was excited when infrastructure investment became a recurring theme during the 2016 presidential election. I was equally pleased when the President made his commitment to triple the funding level for the Clean and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds. This subcommittee needs to take the next logical step and advance legislation, like a reauthorization of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, to renew the federal commitment to meeting our community's infrastructure needs. This straightforward legislation, last approved on a bipartisan basis by this committee in 2009, will help our communities meet the challenges of a changing water-related environment and creating well-paying jobs in the United States. But we need to do much more. We need to address the very real affordability concerns raised by the communities in a way that does not weaken the Clean Water Act protections and ensures our neighborhoods have access to clean, safe water and reliable local environments. We need to look at targeting more additional federal resources to our urban and rural communities when the traditional tools fail to meet the financial challenges these communities face on a daily basis. Mr. Chairman, I believe this committee can play an integral part in creating and sustaining family wage jobs and ensuring U.S. economic competitiveness and improving the daily lives of all Americans. And I do look forward to working with you on a bipartisan basis to honor these commitments to our communities. And I yield back.
Thank you. And again, look forward to working with you and continuing to find common ground. With that, yield to the chairman of the full committee, gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Schuster.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. This is a great way to start off your first committee with a hearing, as chairman of this subcommittee with a hearing like this. So I appreciate it. I won't tell anybody our private advice I gave you beforehand, but I know you do extremely well. This is an important hearing, and as the chairman mentioned, the President of the United States has said that he wants to figure out how to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure. And look, $1 trillion is not going to come from the federal government. It's got to come from a number of different sources. There has to be a federal component to it. We know that look at the Highway Trust Fund, the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, and then the Waterway Trust Fund, other sources of revenue. We've got to figure out how to get the federal revenue up to help with these projects and do its fair share and do its important part of the work. Public-private partnerships are part of that solution. I think it's a good tool in the toolbox, but it's not the toolbox. It's in there to help and assist, and we got to figure out ways to do that better. But there's a lot of private money and local money out there. Just in my home state of Pennsylvania, there's two $4 billion pipeline projects, 100% privately funded, and we've got government agencies getting in the way of moving these forward. And I look across this country, and there's billions of dollars across this country that are stuck in the mud, so to speak, with these government agencies, and most of them, many times, it's the federal agencies. And so reform has to be a huge part of this effort. And I know that you folks here, you all deal with the Corps of Engineers, and I know as my experience has been across this country, it takes far too long to get these projects approved. And in many cases, they take years to do it, and the projects don't change that much because they were pretty sound projects to begin with. So it's not just the Corps, it's FERC, it's, again, you go across these government agencies, they've got to get to the table at the same time, they've got to get these projects done, because if you think about the interstate highway system, they built 47,000 miles of interstate highway in 14 years. I have 60 miles of roadway. It took 35 years to get through my district. And that's just unthinkable in today's society with the technology, the science we have to be able to check these different projects out. We ought to be able to move them forward, and that's something that I know the chairman, this chairman, the former chairman, Mr. Gibbs, and myself are all committed to getting these reforms in place to move these projects forward. When you look at the lack of investment in our ports, our harbors, inland waterways, the locks, the dams, flood protection, environmental restoration, these are all things that we need to move forward with much faster than we have in the past, and I think that we can do that. One of the things that I will be supporting moving forward, and I've always supported, but we got to get the system put in place in the right way, is the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. Those dollars, $1.8 billion, we only spend $1 billion on harbors and ports. The other $800 million, not sure where it goes, here and there and everywhere. But those dollars were put in that fund, and the trust was that it was going to be spent on those projects and those ports and those harbors. So again, we've talked with the president, his people. We've got to get that into their budget. It makes it easier for us to get it into our budget. So I'm committed to working forward to see that those dollars get spent on what their intended purposes were. And when you look at that $800 million, there's probably a 3, 4, 5, 6 times multiplier, because when the federal government comes to the table with its dollars, the locals, the states, the private sector are all going to make the investments needed to do what they have to do in those ports and harbors around the country. So again, for me, this is an exciting time. Never did I think that a Republican president would be the one to stand up at an inaugural address and use the words infrastructure, but it happened, and I'm just glad to be here and be part of this, and I'm really excited about this hearing today and as we go forward. So thank you all very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And now recognize the ranking member, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to both welcome the witnesses and want to congratulate you on your first hearing as chair. I know you're vitally interested in water issues, coming from a somewhat watery state, shall we say. And, you know, I'm pleased to be working with you, and I'm pleased that today we're jointly sending a letter to President Trump urging him to fully utilize the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund as a part of his trillion-dollar infrastructure plan. As Chairman Schuster noted, $9 billion have been diverted into a theoretical fund over at the Treasury. Every day, every American who buys an imported good pays a little bit more for it, with the understanding that that is going to go to facilitate the movement of freight in and out of the United States through our ports, and that more efficient movement would actually pretty much offset the minuscule tax. Unfortunately, if you don't spend the tax, then you still have the delays and the ships parked miles out into the ocean, and so people are paying the tax, the money isn't being spent, and they're paying more for the imported goods because of the delays. We're breaking faith with the American people. It seems kind of like a no-brainer. On a daily basis, our 59 busiest harbors have 35% availability of maximum depth. And that's not even to deal with the new challenges of the post-Panamax ships. So I'm hopeful that we can move forward with that. I did get a version of that, somewhat awkward and crippled, out of this committee because of the budget rules, which are waived on a daily basis around here. But in that case, boy, they had to be enforced. So I'm hopeful we'll do it honestly and just say, hey, forget about the stupid budget rules. Let's spend the tax for the purpose for which it was collected, deal with the maintenance backlog in our harbors, and more efficiently move freight. I'm one who's always tried to find that there's like a regulatory pendulum. They can swing way over here or way over there. The sweet spot's in the middle, and it's always difficult to get there. I believe there are unnecessary delays and impediments due sometimes to bureaucracy and to misguided regulations. I've been having an ongoing dispute with FEMA and National Marine Fisheries up in my region, so I can understand that, and I welcome an honest discussion of that. But I also caution that you don't swing to the other extreme, which is, we're just going to facilitate projects whether or not they're well thought out, whether or not they have community support, and whether or not they might have unintended consequences. Look at 50 years ago, the Central and Southern Florida Project, which was authorized in '48, which diked Lake Okeechobee, Kissimmee River. Part of the Everglades was drained. It's widely recognized by the residents, the communities, and everyone around there as a disaster. And now Congress, 50 years later, passed a plan that costs $10 billion to reverse some of that. So if we approach some of these major projects in a more balanced way, I think we'll be better off and not have to try and reverse their impacts later. We've had significant testimony before this committee including a former colleague who was head of the Corps of Engineers for a brief period of time until he came here before this committee, presented the Bush budget for Corps of Engineers, and I said, is that budget adequate to deal with these backlogs and all these other problems we have? And he said, no. The next week, he resigned to spend more time with his family. You know, we need to encourage honesty. And the honest thing is the most major impediment is lack of funding, plain and simple. And then we can deal with any regulatory burdens that crop up in the interim. I mean, in surface, you can't say that the 150,000 bridges out there, 99% of which are not going to require any major environmental analysis that need to be repaired or replaced, are not getting done because of environmental restrictions. They're not getting done because the government isn't investing the money in the national highway system. It's the same with our ports and harbors, which is under the jurisdiction of this subcommittee. So I welcome the witnesses here today. I want to hear and hope to hear about that kind of balance and the need to better invest. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to excuse me, turn to our first witness. We have Mr. Jerry Ellig, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Mr. Ellig, recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, is the timer working? Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I should say to multiple chairs and multiple ranking members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jerry Ellig. I'm an economist and a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And I come to approach today's topics a little bit differently because I was asked to talk a little bit about some general problems and tendencies in the U.S. federal regulatory process that may be the source of some of the frustrations that some of the members of the committee and the subcommittee just mentioned in some of the opening statements. I come to this as a generalist. Most of my research in the past 15 years has focused on the federal regulatory process and performance management of federal agencies, so I don't come to this as an expert on the particular programs this committee has jurisdiction over. But nevertheless, I was asked to talk about some general regulatory issues. There is a tendency in our federal regulatory process for folks to focus on intentions rather than outcomes, intentions rather than results. And there are at least three kind of symptoms of this that I can mention. One is a tendency of regulatory decision makers to focus on activities and outputs rather than results. So we have, for example, a lot of folks in federal agencies who honestly believe that their job and their success should be measured by production of regulations or perhaps by enforcement activity rather than how many problems do they solve, what do they actually accomplish. A colleague of mine at the Mercatus Center interviewed a number of economists in federal regulatory agencies a number of years ago, and one of them described the way his agency worked as success is putting out 10 regulations a year, and bigger regulations are bigger successes. You notice there's nothing in there about actually achieving results because we're focused on measuring activities and outputs rather than focused on measuring what have you actually accomplished with the regulation. And so the solution really has to start with Congress articulating what outcomes it wants to achieve when it authorizes regulatory legislation, and then following up to ensure that retrospective assessment is done to find out, did the regulation achieve the intended purpose, and if so, at what cost? Another related problem is there are often serious deficiencies in the analysis that federal agencies are supposed to do that are supposed to inform regulatory decisions. Now, a lot of water projects and other types of projects go through some type of benefits cost analysis, and you might say, well, gee, what's sauce for the goose ought to be sauce for the gander. Folks who want to constrain what can be done in those projects through regulation should also be going through the same kind of analysis, and executive branch agencies are required to do this by executive orders. But we often find that there are serious deficiencies and omissions in the analysis, and that's based on, I've seen that in my research, a lot of other folks who actually research the quality of agency analysis, regulatory agency analysis, find the same thing. The final problem we often have is something I call ready, fire, aim regulation. Now, this occurs when regulatory agencies essentially decide what they want to do and only then conduct the research that is supposed to inform their decision. And the process of doing the research becomes the process of creating a litigation support document to support decisions that have already been made for other reasons. One of my colleagues who actually spent 27 years as an economist in the federal government told me about an adventure he had where he was working on a regulation, the agency had already decided to issue it, he was still working on the analysis that was supposed to determine whether it was worth doing, and he was told on a Friday afternoon, if you can't find more benefits over the weekend, don't bother coming back to work on Monday. Folks, that's not the way that that regulatory agencies should be approaching regulation. And again, this does not always happen. There are good, committed people at regulatory agencies who do a good job figuring out what they're supposed to do before they make decisions. But there's also plenty of research that demonstrates that there are often some pretty significant deficiencies in either the quality of agencies' underlying analysis, or maybe they do good analysis, but they don't necessarily pay attention to it. So all three of these kind of problems occur when we focus on good intentions rather than focusing on outcomes. And if we want to fix the problem, we need to flip that around so that we're focused on regulatory outcomes first and the evidence of what's happening, whether it's being done, and what agencies are actually trying to accomplish.
Thank you. Our next witness is the Honorable Gary McCarthy, Mayor of Schenectady, New York. Mayor McCarthy, recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Schuster, Chairman Graves, Mr. Napolitano, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. Since 2011, Schenectady has borrowed collectively just under $53 million to be spent on upgrading pipes, replacing equipment, and rehabilitating our wastewater treatment plant. 2017, the city is embarking on an SSO mitigation project, including a $24 million project to eliminate a sanitary sewer overflow and $6 million to improve our system's overall resiliency. Schenectady does not contest the importance of environmental protections and efforts and has significantly invested in these projects. But we're being forced to expend even more funds while we're still attempting to recover from the Great Recession and decades of population decline in an old industrial city. Our strong local economic recovery has been placed in a precarious situation by this significant burden. In addition to the tax burden, the consent order that Schenectady operates under requires a 4-to-1 exchange for new connections. And I want to emphasize that Schenectady is not allowed to do a new hookup unless I remove 4 other hookups or entry points within the system. This critically limits our economic development projects and is totally counterproductive to what we've been trying to accomplish in our community. While we face the burden of traditional infrastructure, we're only scratching the surface on what's possible through smart city technology. Our partnerships with our business community have allowed us to install, at this point, roughly 200 smart lights, which will reduce our cost and improve the delivery of several key city services. This emerging technology allows us to use this platform for real change. Data will be collected and disseminated to users, allowing much more educated and appropriate decisions to be made. Additional devices such as analytic cameras, temperature and motion sensors, traffic monitoring devices, and the potential for interconnected healthcare and other life safety devices deployed on a network of over 5,000 city streetlights provides an opportunity to evaluate numerous core challenges in an urban environment. This 21st century infrastructure cannot be ignored while we bear the burden of investment in the more traditional infrastructure. To do so would be to put the city and the nation's long-term is a peril, as we miss this critical opportunity for economic growth and improve educational opportunities and long-term efficiencies within our communities. What I would ask today is that we need increasing partnership. We're look to continue the SRF program as well as CDBG, and looking to provide grants in the WIFIA funding and protecting municipal bonds. In other ways that you can help would include passing the integrated planning and affordability legislation, commonly referred to as H.R. 465. I want to thank Mr. Gibbs for listening to the mayor's concerns regarding unfunded mandates and affordability in his introduction of H.R. 465. This bill would allow local governments to work with the EPA to develop plans where we can comprehensively deal with the biggest environmental and public health needs first, and do it in a way that is more affordable to our citizens. I have a letter that's signed by members representing the U.S. Conference of Mayors asking for co-sponsors in the passage of H.R. 465, and that's been attached to my testimony submitted to you. By reauthorizing and fully funding the Brownfields Law, you will be encouraging the recycling and reusing of properties and upgrading of existing infrastructure. In addition, many communities redevelop brownfields to create more green infrastructure, which helps with stormwater controls. And I've already mentioned how Schenectady is utilizing new technology for our above-ground systems. However, there can also be improvements that can be made below ground. All utilities can improve service through the incorporation of modern technology, specifically designed to increase efficiencies and reduce cost. Congress and the administration should be supporting the renewal of public water and sewer infrastructure in America through new technology. And there's much Congress and the federal government can do to work in partnership with our nation's cities to upgrade our infrastructure and invest in our future. And we need to end the siloed approach of handling issues and think holistically on how to deal with our infrastructure, environmental, economic development concerns as we work together. Again, I thank the committee for the opportunity to be here today and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And to introduce our next witness, I'm going to recognize Mr. Nolan.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Napolitano and members of the committee. As a member of the full committee, I'm grateful for your allowing me to sit in on today's important hearing. By way of introduction, let me say, one thing we all agree on is that our nation's outdated and obsolete wastewater treatment and drinking water systems are desperately in need of repair, and in many cases crumbling before our eyes and degrading our waters and the health of our people. With that in mind, it's my honor to introduce my good friend, Minnesota's good friend, our Commissioner of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, John Link Stein, who's here on behalf of the Environmental Council of States. John has spent over 30 years as a powerful and tireless and gifted advocate in the fight to protect our precious air and water and land from pollution and degradation. We're all very proud of his great leadership, and I'm very proud to have the opportunity to introduce him to the committee here today. John, welcome, and thank you to the committee for allowing me to make this introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Nolan. Ms. Stein, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman Nolan. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity, and Ranking Member Napolitano. I am John Link Stein. I'm Commissioner of the Pollution Control Agency, as Mr. Nolan said, and I represent also as the President of Environmental Council of the States, otherwise known as ECOS, a nonpartisan national organization of my colleagues who lead state and territorial environmental protection agencies across America. And Chairman Graves, as you know, the Mississippi River begins in the state of Minnesota at Lake Itasca and ends in your state. And I take it as my duty to deliver the cleanest water possible that Minnesota can send your way. States hear every day from our citizens about the value of clean water, adequate flood control, and prevention of pollution. Infrastructure underpins every one of those issues, and we know that a society cannot thrive without clean water. Industry and jobs depend on a reliable water supply and the capacity to process wastewater. Clean water is vital to manufacturing, recreation, and other industries that are central to our economy. And in Minnesota, a community of Worthington in southwestern Minnesota is making needed improvements to their wastewater treatment plant to accommodate a meatpacking operation that needs to expand. Nearby, Morris, another community, needs to make improvements to their drinking water system to provide water for their ethanol plant. ECOS aims to strengthen the partnership between the states and the federal government to implement our nation's environmental laws and policies, focusing on results. Water infrastructure is one of the focus areas of our ECOS document, Priority Issues in a Time of Political Transition, which we produced to address the new administration's priorities. Our members identified 20 priority projects for wastewater and water supply by state that were ready to go in 2017. That list amounts to $18.2 billion in need. Our country prospered and thrived thanks to the investments that were made in water infrastructure 75 to 100 years ago. And some of the most significant of those have occurred since the passage of the Clean Water and Safe Drinking Water Acts. Federal, state, and local partnerships help make those investments successful, and we need to continue to make investments that are critical to the upkeep of those initial investments. Federal funding using portions of the EPA's state and tribal assistance grants, which make up the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Funds, are critical to those investments. The revolving nature of those loan programs and states' efforts to maximize the federal capitalization grants ensure a continuing return on investment. The successful history of national water and wastewater programs, however, is overshadowed by the enormous and extensive need. Estimates range from $384 billion through 2030 for our drinking water infrastructure and $271 billion through 2022 for wastewater infrastructure needs. Our distressed urban areas, small communities, and rural communities are particularly pressed to make the needed water infrastructure investments. Many of these communities find it difficult to keep up with the numerous, increasingly complex federal requirements due to small tax base, lack of adequate financing options, management skills, trained personnel, and systems to manage environmental requirements. ECOS continues to raise the importance of efficient, affordable, and timely financial award to these distressed communities. For example, the community of Gilbert in Representative Nolan's, Congressman Nolan's district, is a mining town that is facing an $8.6 million project to replace an old wastewater treatment plant to reduce overflows of raw sewage. They have declining population, high unemployment. They simply cannot afford a project of that size without assistance. Reliable infrastructure is critical to the protection of public health and community well-being because water is a serious health threat. In southern Minnesota community of St. Peter, they had high nitrate levels in their groundwater because of shallow groundwater is the only available water source in that part of our state. And in order to protect their community, they needed to make the investments to treat for nitrates, and they did it to protect the children's health and those of their elderly. Minnesota has invested in programs to monitor and regulate corrosion and aging water systems, and we need to continue to do that at the state level. As science has increased the awareness of public health risks and environmental regulatory system has grown more complex, there are disagreements over the costs and levels of protection that continue to make national headlines, but we must remember our foremost obligation to protect the environment and public health through investments in our country's infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Stein. Our next witness is Mr. Mike Inamina, who's Executive Director of the Sutter Butte Flood Control Agency. Mr. Inamina, recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Napolitano, and members of the committee. My name is Mike Inamina, and I am Executive Director of the Sutter Butte Flood Control Agency. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee on this most important and timely issue. Before beginning my testimony, I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge Congressman LaMalfa and Garamendi, who are not here right now. These are two members of the committee who have been true partners on these local efforts from the start. But for their efforts, I would be telling a very different story today. Sutter Butte Flood Control Agency, or SBUFCA as it is known, was formed in 2007 to consolidate the efforts of several agencies and communities with flood management responsibilities and implementing locally led flood protection projects. SBUFCA is a joint powers authority composed of the cities of Biggs, Gridley, Live Oak, Yuba City, the counties of Sutter and Butte, levy districts 1 and 9. Sabufka leads the planning and implementation of flood control projects in this historic agricultural basin. Sutter Butte Basin covers 300 square miles along the west bank of the Feather River, immediately downstream of Lake Oroville. The basin is home to 95,000 residents and encompasses $7 billion of damageable assets. The region has sustained numerous floods, including the 1955 levee failure on the Feather River, which resulted in the deaths of at least 38 people. Goals of the agency are to achieve 200-year level of flood protection for urban communities in the north and 100-year protection or equivalent in the south, in the rural areas. Under state law, urban or urbanizing areas cannot be developed without achieving 200-year level of protection. That's twice the FEMA level of protection, thus eliminating opportunities for risky residential development. Sabufka is nearing completion of the $300 million Feather River West Levee project that provides 200-year level of protection for the northern basin. The United States Army Corps of Engineers has traditionally been the most important builder of flood projects, as well as the most powerful regulator of these same projects. I'd like to briefly comment on the local relationship with the Corps of Engineers under these two important processes. Basically, there are two ways for a local agency to get a federal project levy fixed in California. Partner with the Corps of Engineers under the Civil Works program and wait a couple of decades or more. The second path is for a local agency to pass a local assessment, often very difficult, then cost share with the state of California and be consistent with the strategic Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. Then seek permission from the federal government to fix their levy under an article of law called Section 408. This latter process is also quite slow, taking 3 to 4 years for large flood projects. This year, Sabufka will complete the Feather River West Levee project, which improves about 30 miles of federal project levee without changing the design or purpose of the project and without spending a dime of federal money. Yet this permission process took 19 months and is considered light speed, a world's record. The Corps has recently improved the Civil Works planning process. Sabufka was pleased to be one of 4 pilot projects selected from throughout the country to test the 3x3x3 planning process. To the Corps' great credit, the Sutter Basin study was a great success and met all objectives. The Corps delivered. However, authorization is only part of the story. The appropriations process takes more acts of Congress and can take several years, never mind construction. In the case of the Feather River West Levee project, we've already constructed 80% of the federal project with our own money, yet we are struggling to get the federal government to finish the job. Thus, the successes of the planning study, state, local, innovative financing, and local initiative may be squandered on this traditional appropriations process. There are a number of things the Corps can do to improve risk reduction, whether performed by local, state, federal, or even private entities. Prioritize work by risk reduction, not who builds the project. Incorporate the successful 3x3x3 process into the 408 permission. We are heartened and grateful that Civil Works Director James Dalton has already initiated changes, and we hope to see these expanded and codified. This is a big deal for local agencies. Do not intermingle 408 permission processes with separate Civil Works process. Otherwise, delays are inevitable. Allow local, state, and even private entities to construct Civil Works projects. WRDA 2014 includes a provision to advance this concept. However, this pilot has not happened to date. And finally, proactively consult with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation on issues concerning Native American cultural resources. This statement would be incomplete without noting the importance of the single most important flood control feature on the Feather River, Oroville Dam. The Feather River is the discharge channel of Oroville Spillway. Dams and levees are a system, and as the ongoing crisis at Oroville Dam evolves, it is easy to forget that the primary failure mode that will result in loss of life and property is not necessarily dam spillway failure, but rather levee failure. Oroville Dam has appropriately captured all of our attention at the moment, but we cannot neglect the vulnerability of our levees in the system that includes the Oroville Dam. Thank you for holding this hearing and your continued attention to these important issues. Our lives and livelihoods depend on it.
Thank you very much. Next witness is Mr. Jonathan Kernion. Thank you very much for being here, President of Cycle Construction Company.
Thank you. Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Napolitano, Chairman Schuster, and other members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak before you today. I am Jonathan Kernion, President of Cycle Construction Company based in Kenner, Louisiana. Our company is a family-operated general construction firm. Founded in the late 1990s, we focus on heavy civil construction, marine construction, coastal restoration, environmental infrastructure, underground utilities, roads, bridges, demolition, waste management, and emergency response. I testify before you as a member of and representing the Associated General Contractors of America. I want to add something in this, when I'm talking, and I'm going to plagiarize something I heard from one of our levee district heads down in South Lafourche. He's been waiting now to build the levee for 5 years to get a wetlands permit so he could build the levee to save literally hundreds of thousands of lives, money, property, everything else. And he still hasn't gotten a wetlands permit. And he made a very, very unique reference to that. And he said that in 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. We were not a superpower at the time, but at the time, we didn't have much, as far as power. And what he said was, in the 4 years after that, we built close to 80,000 aircraft, 1,200 large combat ships, recruited and trained well over 7 million combat-ready troops, and we became a superpower of the world. But today, in 2017, he can't get a federal wetland permit in 5 years to build a levee to save lives, which pretty much sums up the story and tells it. I'll go on from there. In order to build the 21st century infrastructure, we need to be able to build it sometime this century. Sadly, that's easier said than done. There are many kinks in the chain that can delay construction for years. In my testimony, I'll try to highlight some opportunities to more efficiently deliver water infrastructure projects during the pre-construction and actual construction phases. Before construction begins, there are too many federal agency cooks in the environmental review and permitting kitchen. They follow laws and regulatory processes that came about independently, laid on top of one another with little or no regard for how they fit in the overall process. And even when you get to the top of the environmental review ladder, a not in my backyard lawsuit can shoot you down to the beginning of the game. As such, projects can be delayed years and even decades waiting for environmental reviews and permits to be completed. In my home state of Louisiana, we don't have years to protect and restore our environmental sensitive coastline. A football field's worth of coastline erosion occurs on average every hour. It is alarmingly ironic that the lengthy environmental permitting and review processes that are intended to protect our coastline could, at least in part, lead to its further destruction. AGC looks forward to working with this committee to better integrate the federal environmental review and permitting process, building upon the reforms of NEPA and the past transportation reauthorization bills, and curbing frivolous environmental lawsuits. During construction, contractors face two primary problems: certain and reliable project funding streams and federal agency indecision. We do not build our homes from the ground up over a course of 30 years. However, we too often build our nation's water infrastructure that way. Or we can point to federal agencies as a cause for many problems. The buck starts and stops with Congress, literally. Until Congress allows water infrastructure projects to be funded outside the whims of the annual appropriation process, where funding comes in uncertain dips and drabs, we will continue to face unnecessary construction delays. One of the greatest challenges contractors face on the federal water infrastructure job site is obtaining decisions from federal agencies. Former President Theodore Roosevelt, discredited, was saying, in any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing, the next best thing you can do is the wrong thing, and the worst thing you can do is nothing. As with any construction project, unforeseen issues may and will emerge. The problem comes with getting the federal agency to make a decision to act or not. Decisions may have to move up the chain of command. If the right person or persons are not available, the decision sits on their desks. AGC hopes to work with the committee to reduce the links in the chain of command necessary to shorten and obtain timely decisions during construction. Thank you again for inviting AGC to testify before the committee today. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Kernion. Our next witness is Ms. Kathy Pape, Senior Vice President for Regulatory Policy and Business Development at American Waterworks Company. Ms. Pape, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Napolitano, Chairman Schuster, and members of the committee. My name is Kathy Pape, Senior Vice President of Regulatory Policy and Business Development at Pennsylvania American Water, at American Water, which is the largest investor-owned water and wastewater service provider in the United States. We provide water and wastewater service to about 15 million people in 47 states, and that includes 12 military bases as well. I appear before you today on behalf of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Executive Council on Infrastructure. That group's goal is to focus on how private investors can help to fund public projects. We have 3 recommendations for you today, but before I get into those 3 recommendations, I would like to give you a real-life example of a private company helping a public project about 110 miles north of here in Fairview Township, Pennsylvania, in late 2015. Fairview Township decided to sell its wastewater system to Pennsylvania American Water. As a result, that township was able to pay off all of its sewer debt, was able to reduce property taxes by 50%, and it was able to refund a $10,000 per customer hookup fee that the township charged. Just one example of many that I could give. We have 3 recommendations today, and the first one involves where investment goes. And our belief is, and recommendation, is that investment should go towards sustainable and compliant water and wastewater systems. That means spend federal money wisely. The way the system is set up now, most federal dollars will go toward the most non-compliant systems. There's points given for non-compliance. Our belief is that putting money toward a poorly run system is like a shot of Botox. It's short-term, it won't erase years of abuse, and you'll need it again and again and again. Dollars should go towards those systems that are capital efficient and that are also cost transparent. And by that, I mean systems that charge true cost of service. Many times, true cost of service is not charged either because there's been an influx of government money or because government leaders don't believe that charging true cost of service will help them politically. But a system is not sustainable if true cost of service is not charged. Our second recommendation goes towards options and alternatives. As somebody said this morning, the federal government can't fully fund $1 trillion, but there are many private investors who are willing to help do that. We have 56,000 community water systems, 19,000 wastewater pipe systems, 14,000 wastewater treatment systems, many of which were funded in the 70s by government grants, and those government grants aren't around anymore. So we have our economic vitality being challenged, as well as the health of our children and grandchildren. We need to look for new ways and break down regulatory burdens, more alternatives, more options. And finally, the third recommendation is relatively simple, and that goes to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Private companies are not eligible for funding under the clean water or the wastewater part. We can access drinking water state revolving funds. So we would ask that that is one of the ways to help private companies help the government to fund the infrastructure that's needed. In summary, our recommendations are 3. Invest wisely, put dollars toward those systems that are most compliant, that are sustainable, and have a track record of doing what should be done. Second, that is break down those regulatory barriers and offer more options. Many of those barriers have been mentioned this morning. And finally, provide access to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund.
Thank you, Ms. Pape. I appreciate your testimony. And our last witness is Mr. Kevin DeGood, who's Director of Infrastructure Policy at the Center for American Progress. Mr. DeGood, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Napolitano and members of the committee for inviting me to testify. It is an honor and a privilege to contribute to this committee's work. Water is an essential element of our daily lives and vital to our economy. The start of the 115th Congress presents members with the opportunity to review the investments and policies needed to move the country forward in the coming years. And while the elections on November 8th produced a change in leadership in Washington, one thing remains clear. No one walked into a voting booth demanding dirtier water, lower wages, and higher profits for Wall Street. And yet, weakening the Clean Water Act, eliminating Davis-Bacon prevailing wage standards, and pushing high-cost equity capital through public-private partnerships will do all of those things. Rather than rolling back the environmental progress of recent decades, this Congress has a clear mandate to build a stronger, cleaner future for our communities by providing direct funding to improve water quality and reliability, flood control, and navigation in a sustainable way. State and local governments, as well as drinking and wastewater authorities, face enormous infrastructure challenges. Many legacy facilities have come to the end of their useful life, requiring major rehabilitation or outright replacement. At the same time, population growth, source water pollution, and increasingly extreme weather patterns brought about by climate change have added to the complexity and cost of providing safe and reliable water and protecting against the ravages of flooding, drought, and sea level rise. The EPA estimates that the nation will need approximately $655 billion to maintain current health and environmental standards. The recent winter storms that have lashed Northern California offer a powerful lesson in how rapid swings from intense drought to intense precipitation can overwhelm critical facilities that were designed using more stable climatic assumptions. More than 180,000 residents in the Oroville region had to be evacuated on short notice due to spillway failures. This episode highlights the fragility of older facilities and the essential role that water infrastructure plays in supporting public health, safety, and economic productivity. California is not alone in facing water infrastructure challenges from climate change. For example, South Florida must modernize a host of facilities to deal with rising seas. For these communities, adapting to climate change is an issue of basic economic viability. Based on detailed technical work from Swiss Re, a major company in the reinsurance industry, the Miami-Dade Sea Level Rise Task Force determined that major improvements would be needed to, quote, avoid or postpone wholesale abandonment due to non-insurability or the high cost of premiums. The stress that climate change places on the built environment will only grow over time. We have a choice: invest and adapt, or pay an even higher price down the road. In the Cleveland area, the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District faces significant challenges meeting Clean Water Act standards. Like many older communities, Cleveland has a combined sewer system that during heavy rains often discharges untreated wastewater into the Cuyahoga River and Lake Erie. On average, the district discharges more than 4 billion gallons of untreated sewage each year. In 2011, the district entered into a consent decree with the Environmental Protection Agency to make numerous upgrades to their system, including a combination of gray and green infrastructure. These public agencies responsible for managing the water infrastructure highlighted by these examples share one key characteristic. They don't need another credit card from Washington or to saddle taxpayers with expensive private equity through public-private partnerships. What these jurisdictions need is a strong federal partner ready to provide direct funding. Proponents of public-private partnerships often state that there are billions of dollars of capital, quote, waiting on the sidelines. Implicit in this statement is that water agencies and other project sponsors face a lack of liquidity. This is simply not the case. Demand for public debt in the U.S. is robust. Moreover, the favorable tax treatment afforded to municipal bond investors means the public sector is able to secure municipal financing that is often 3 to 5 times cheaper than equity capital. Today, the public sector has access to municipal financing as well as federal credit facilities like WIFIA and federally supported state revolving funds at historically low rates. Simply stated, for many cities and water utilities, access to affordable credit is not the binding constraint. Instead, there is a shortage, the shortage of local revenues to support new project debts. Many communities do not take full advantage of their capacity to generate additional revenue through taxes and user fees. However, even when they do, there are real limits on the total additional revenue they can reasonably generate, which often falls short of overall needs. Increased federal funding is needed to grow our economy, ensure timely compliance with water quality mandates, as well as to deal with changes presented by climate change. These resources should be used to leverage additional state and local dollars where possible and to target those communities facing the greatest need. Additionally, federal funds should focus on those categories of projects that all too often take a back seat to traditional gray infrastructure, including efficiency upgrades, watershed restoration, and non-point source pollution mitigation. Thank you again for the opportunity to address this committee.
Thank you, Mr. DeGood. Appreciate your testimony. We're going to go ahead and roll into questions, and I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Ehrlich, when I was reading your testimony last night, I was really impressed with the thought process, and that you talked about appropriate metrics on regulations and ensuring that that regulations are truly focused upon outcomes that are in the best interest of the American public. Just a few months ago or a few weeks ago, we had bipartisan legislation that was included into the Regulatory Accountability Act, a bill that we had introduced last year called Prove It. And what that does is it requires that federal agencies come back 5 years after a regulation has been finalized to collect actual compliance information from stakeholders, not predicting, but actually collecting real information, doing a look back, determining the impact of those, the true impact of those regulations. And we were shocked to find that there was little required of agencies to actually go back and true up their cost estimates in terms of the cost of compliance with regulations. Do you have specific examples of where you've seen regulations or the regulatory process improperly applied that you could cite?
Well, I think some of the types of Okay. Some of the types of problems like that I've seen and that my colleagues at the Mercatus Center have seen in their research involve barriers that maybe prevent better or more intensive use of some of the existing infrastructure. For example, several of my colleagues have looked into the issue of supersonic flight and found that one of the biggest barriers to supersonic flight in the United States is it's banned in the continental United States. And this was because of a legitimate concern about noise, about sonic booms. But with advances in materials, advances in engineering, it may very well be possible to design airplanes, probably not as big as the Concorde, but design airplanes that can actually travel at supersonic speeds while meeting a reasonable noise standard that protects the public. And that's the difference between focusing on outcomes versus just focusing on intentions. If we really want a regulation that focuses on outcomes, then have a noise standard that supersonic air transport needs to meet. Don't ban it entirely. But those are the kind of barriers to innovation that we get when we just, focus more on the process rather than getting results.
Thank you. And I think I'd love for you to give a clinic to federal regulatory agencies to focus on outcomes and true interest of the American public. Mr. Iannamina, I want to ask two questions. Number one, you talked about the 408 process, and certainly that's been something that I think Ranking Member Napolitano and I have both heard a lot of concerns about, just the predictability and timeframes associated with that review process. While certainly it's important to ensure that we understand the impact of any project to federal infrastructure, federal water resource infrastructure. Can you talk about the timeline of and I know you mentioned 19 months lightning speed, but the timeline of that decision and what would have happened if it was approved faster?
So for that specific incident, I say 19 months. It actually took much longer. And I want to point out, this is not a hit piece on the Corps of Engineers. They're really competent, well-meaning, smart people that were working on this 408 process. I think they're bound up in a very stovepipe organization that makes it very difficult to perform, because the outcome of this, as noted by the previous speaker, is public safety. It's very important. Most people are generally pointed in that direction. Now, with regard to 19 months, what had to happen was the Corps of Engineers, in order to set that world's record of a very fast 408 process, they had to split the project up into two pieces. We had a levee at the time, just prior to construction, that was suffering some internal erosion. We just found evidence of that just the year prior. It is a site of the historic 1955 failure, very dangerous site. It was recognized as the highest priority, highest risk levee on that system. And so staff, to their credit, Corps staff, to their credit, split the project into two pieces. But under the normal process,
we got 25 seconds left.
We might still be waiting for that project to resolve.
Last, very quickly, you are a non-federal sponsor with a project with the Corps of Engineers. Can you just tell me the percentage of cost that you implementing the project on your own as opposed to doing it with the federal government? You compare those two.
We're completing a state of California and locally funded project that encompasses the vast majority of the parallel federal project. And so our costs have been roughly half of what the federal cost estimate is to do it under the normal process.
Thank you very much. Recognize Ranking Member Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Thank you all for your testimony today, and as I stated in the opening statement, my communities often approach me about the need for increased federal funding. That's why I'm conflicted by the statements of President Trump. On one hand, he called for tripling the amount of funding in the Clean Water Drinking State Revolving Fund. We call that a win. On the other hand, the forthcoming infrastructure proposal reportedly to focus solely on increased use of private financing could close our nation's infrastructure gap. It won't work for many of my communities. Most recently, we learned the president plans to cut the funding for EPA by close to 30%. It would have a devastating impact on the ability of my state and other state communities to address their water quality challenges. Starting with the State Revolving Fund Authority, Ranking Member DeFazio and I are planning to reintroduce legislation to finally reauthorize Clean Water SRF. To the panel, all of you, yes or no, Clean Water State Revolving Fund program is an important tool to address local water challenges, and would you urge this committee to reauthorize the program? Yes or no?
I'd say yes and no, and use private capital when you can get it.
I would encourage it be reauthorized. Again, the revolving loan fund provides that mechanism for financing for municipalities that sometimes just is not there otherwise.
On behalf of all states, we have several resolutions at ECOS that would say yes.
Thank you.
I'll abstain as the flood guy.
I tend to agree with Mr. Ellick at the end that use a little bit of both.
When necessary.
Yes, ma'am.
I would say yes, and certainly give access to private companies as well, and marry it up with private funding as well.
We strongly support the ranking member's proposal to reauthorize the SRF and to expand to $4 billion a year.
Thank you. Many of you directly utilize programs or funding provided through the EPA. What will be the impact of a 30% cut in these programs to the ability to meet your local needs? Ms. Stein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Napolitano, the states have been working with the EPA and with OMB in the last 3 weeks to understand the magnitude of the cuts. At this point, we have not seen the actual programmatic budget line items that are proposed. However, a 30% reduction in the state and tribal assistance grants, which include a variety of sources of revenue that states rely on for implementation of our basic water and air protection programs, as well as brownfield and Superfund sites, would cut across approximately 15 to 25% of most state programs.
Thank you. Last week, Mr. Stein, the Environmental Council of State submitted a letter to Mr. Trump and the administration on proposed cuts, which I ask unanimous consent to include in the record. In this letter, you state the cuts to EP budget will have, quote, have profound impact on states' ability to implement the core environmental programs expected by our citizens, close quote, including clean water programs and state permitting programs. Can you elaborate a little more?
Mr. Chair, Ms. Napolitano, yes, that is a statement that builds on my previous statement, which is states use the funds to leverage existing programs at the state level. For example, our clean water and drinking water revolving loan programs are matched in the state of Minnesota by capitalized bonds that the state issues to leverage the federal dollars. So that would be one specific impact in my state. But when you look at how states fund their existing environmental protection programs, whether it's air, land, water, all of the states utilize federal funds across a suite of activities. It's too soon to say what the direct impacts would be, but it is, as I stated in the letter, profound.
To Mayor McCarthy, while not a direct focus of the hearing, I too support the EPA's brownfield program. That is why I am concerned to read the President may propose to eliminate all federal funding for brownfield. Is that a proposal that you would support?
No, I would encourage, Congress represents the state level to look at those options to remediate brownfields, to do conversions that bring them back as productive pieces of real estate. Schenectady, my testimony reflects, the testimony that's submitted reflects an old brownfield site which was the American Locomotive Works in the city of Schenectady. It sat there for 50 years. It was abandoned and underutilized, really an embarrassing piece of real estate. Everybody was afraid that it was beyond salvage. When we actually got in and worked through in a systematic process, the remediation was not that, the problems weren't that bad. We were able to put there now, there's we just opened a new casino, which is a $300 million project. We have underway a $150 million mixed-use housing project going immediately adjacent to the Mohawk River. And so it shows that, again, working together, we're able to take that site that people had really ignored and make it really an asset not only for Schenectady but the region.
Congratulations, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We're going to go to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Schuster, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Pape, I appreciate your testimony. Besides upsetting the Botox world, it was fantastic, fantastic testimony, and I think a great example, too. When I talked earlier about private sector dollars, I think the water systems, wastewater, clean water this is an option for us, and only 2%, I think was your testimony said, of water systems are operated by companies like yours. Do you see that growing? Do you see people coming to you more and more saying we need to use a private sector solution?
We've certainly seen it more and more as municipal governments especially have dealt primarily with underfunded pension issues.
Right.
They've looked around and just tried to decide what assets can we sell. Scranton, Pennsylvania is one that we recently acquired at the end of 2016.
And you always buy them? Do you lease them? Or-
We always buy.
Always buy.
And I'd like to explain one of the reasons why, because it goes to the affordability question. One of the methods we have in Pennsylvania is that we can spread the costs, the expenses and the capital costs of our assets over our large base of customers, which is 700,000 in Pennsylvania. So we can use that law when we acquire assets. We couldn't use it if we leased.
And your rates, when they go up, do you do that by yourself, or do you have to consult with somebody to?
The rates have to go through the Public Utility
Right.
Commission through a long 8, 9, 10-month process,
So
and
there-
then
So there's protection for the citizens of you, somebody saying, oh, that's a private company, they're going to jack our rates up. Because one of the biggest challenges I face in my district, a rural district, high senior population, incomes declining, and half the district flows into the Susquehanna, which is the Chesapeake water, and which causes us a lot of problems with water. So again, and I have many, many water systems, old systems that we've tried to push them this way, but it's a challenge to get them to consider this because they're afraid they're going to give up their water and not have any kind of control over it. So I appreciate what you're doing, and I'd like to see more examples because I've seen many examples where you're rebuilding their systems and their rates have not gone through the roofs. In fact, some cases they stay relatively stable. So
we do have a customer assistance program also for people who cannot pay the rates.
Thank you. Mr. Ellig, have you seen any examples of good governance when it comes to these regulations in either the U.S. government or in foreign governments that you can point to say this is how it should run, this is how we see it, so we can use those examples to demonstrate to other agencies that there are cases where this can be done.
Yeah, let me highlight one example. One of the things that I've spent a lot of time looking at is how well federal regulatory agencies account for costs. And typically what they do when they're issuing regulations, most of the agencies that do a good job, they're still only counting compliance expenditures as a measure of cost and not looking at broader costs to society. And some of those costs have been mentioned here. In general, agencies are not good at taking account of the costs that arise when regulations make people wait for stuff. Now, I want to give you the good example. The good example is the U.S. Department of Transportation is actually better at this than most. maybe because it's transportation, and they realize that, waiting time and transit time are important. And so, I'll single out USDOT as being pretty good at trying to take into account the effects of making people wait when it's issuing regulations, and they actually have values that they ascribe to people's travel time and waiting time. So that's a good practice that a lot of other agencies could learn from.
It's good to hear there are some good examples, and I'd like to continue talking to you in this discussion to try to identify more and more of these types of good programs that are out there. And final question to the mayor. You're under a consent decree. One hookup for every 4 you have to de-hook up. What's the ratio? Who came up with that, and what's the sense in that? I don't know.
In New York State, we work with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, which acts as the EPA's representative, and it was the terms that they put forth on the city to enter into the decree and move forward. And we want to remedy the problem where we had the outflow, but that's the terms that they gave us.
Right, but what's it based on? They just pulled it out of the sky and said 1 to 4 sounds good to us? Because it sounds to me like from your testimony, it causes you a lot of harm.
We have right now a project where it's an old industrial city. We've a number of partners have come forth within the community, and we're doing a new construction housing project, fair market, within the city. We're having trouble getting the approval to be able to hook those houses up within the city of Schenectady to handle the wastewater because of the consent order. We're permitted at 18.5 million gallons a day. Our average now is running about 11.8 million last year. And over the last 7 or 8 years, we've reduced the flow within our system by about 4 million gallons a day through dealing with I&I issues. So we've tried to do that. But again, it's that regulatory environment that sometimes logic just is not part of the discussion.
Went over my time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for letting me. And you mentioned an important word, I would say, because my father keeps staring at me on the wall. He would always say to people that come in his office when you start talking logic, he says, that's the greatest sin in Washington, D.C. is to think logically. So I think all of you are sinners at the table today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to go to the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Bustos, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Napolitano. I appreciate you holding this hearing, and I also want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. In Illinois, I represent the northwestern region of Illinois. We have a real problem. Our aging water infrastructure is inefficient and can even put public health at risk. On top of that, we know that our fix-as-fail approach to locks and dams puts our growers and manufacturers, as well as the navigation industry, in a guessing game of whether they'll be able to deliver to consumers on time. So simply unacceptable. When we invest in our water infrastructure, we create good-paying jobs, protect our public health, and help get goods to market more efficiently. There's no reason we shouldn't work together to make sure our country's water infrastructure programs work for users and help address the massive backlog many of our communities face. Again, my district, northwestern Illinois, live along the Mississippi River. The Illinois River runs through the southern part of my congressional district, so locks and dams are absolutely critical. So when I think of the water infrastructure, certainly I also think of water lines and the Clean Water Act. But in my district, we also, as I said, think about navigation. So for the panel, is anyone here prepared to discuss the navigation infrastructure on our rivers? And just wondering if that is something that any of our panelists would care to address. And that can be addressed to any one of you. Anybody want to volunteer for that?
I would go ahead and just say that I think as part of a broader infrastructure package that inland navigation has to be a part of that, and we support efforts to try and take both the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund and Inland Waterways Trust Fund off budget so that the full amount of revenue that is paid in by users through excise taxes on barge fuel and through the goods that are moved through our ports can be put to good use, constructing the kinds of projects and making sure that the number of days that locks and dams are out of service due to maintenance and delays goes down.
Mr. Chair, Madam Bustos, I'm just going to speak to one project that I'm familiar with in my role on the Great Lakes Commission, which is the replacement of the Soo locks, which is a critical piece of infrastructure vital to the economy of the Great Lakes. Our harbor Duluth and Superior in Minnesota, Wisconsin is a key piece of the national infrastructure, creates a vulnerability in our processing of goods and services across the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway, and that is one critical project that the Great Lakes Commission has passed resolutions supporting and has spoken up clearly on. So that's in a different hat that I wear on a different day, and I'll be back next week on behalf of that organization.
Anybody else have anything to add on that topic? All right, so this one I'll address, Mr. Stein, to you, and then also Mayor McCarthy. You guys had mentioned the state revolving funds in your testimony. It's been really important to my congressional district. In the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund has been an invaluable resource in our area. We've got, including $11 million sewer improvement project that wrapped up last year in a town called Rock Island, Illinois. Also in a community called Galesburg in my congressional district, incredibly important to replace about 2,000 solid lead lines that are going to people's homes from the water main, and so very important. Wondering if you have thoughts about the demand for these revolving loans and whether the demand is outpacing what Congress provides annually in appropriations for that fund.
Mr. Chair, Ms. Bustos, yes, the demand far outstrips the available funding. States leverage those dollars through their own resources. Multiple different approaches applied across various states, but the demand, the need is somewhere in the area of a couple $100 billion over the next 5 years just for drinking water systems alone, probably $300 billion over the next 15 years in clean water and wastewater infrastructure. Those funds are, the appropriations through the revolving funds are a significant source of revenue to states and local communities in meeting those needs.
Mayor McCarthy.
Thank you. It's really critical for a lot of municipalities and also smaller levels of government where the revolving loan funds, New York, you also have a set of expertise from that side where they're doing unique projects that are in water and wastewater so that they add a little bit of value to the community. And the low interest and no interest loans are, again, sometimes deal makers in terms of allowing communities to go ahead with the projects to meet the regulatory requirements that we're all dealing with. So I would encourage members to look at funding those at levels that provide adequate resources for the local governments.
All right, thank you, and I've used up my time. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to turn to the former ranking member and a mentor on this committee, Mr. That's right. I'm sorry, former chairman, excuse me, and mentor on this committee, Mr. Gibbs from Ohio, 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I want to congratulate Chairman Graves on your new position. I look forward to working with you in the majority. Anyways, Mr. Ellig, it's really refreshing to hear somebody talk about our challenges we have with regulations and your comment about some of our agencies using research to support their agenda, as I put it, and then also using the media or social media. I can think of one example, and that was the Waters United States rule that was pushed through, I think was biased. Would you agree that that was an example of research to drive an agenda, a political agenda? And
Oh, yeah, I'm aware of that example, and it was highly controversial. I think from my perspective, the bigger problem is when you have agencies that are supposed to be doing objective analysis, and then that gets turned into something that's supposed to be used for advocacy rather than something that's supposed to inform decisions.
Mayor McCarthy, thank you for referencing my integrated planning permitting bill. I really appreciate the support from the Council of Mayors, Conference of Mayors. Can you elaborate a little bit on your consent decrees? You know, this permitting planning bill, you know, is really to develop a long-term plan and set benchmarks and goals. But when you're under a consent decree and under the restrictions of the permit, how's that hindering? Is it on the cost side? What would this bill, how would it really help you on the cost side?
Some quick background on the overflow that we're dealing with is a valve in the city of Schenectady that we would...
Pull the mic closer. Pull the mic closer to you a little bit.
I'm sorry. It's a valve in the city of Schenectady that we would open 2 or 3 times a year for hours during a day to handle high water events. And that is the decree that we had to enter into. It is $14 million that we're addressing to remediate that. We want to stop the outflow, but again, the cost and then the criteria where you have the 4-to-1 offset, it's very frustrating. Where we're taking an old industrial city, we've got a lot of good things happening. We're seeing new investment. We're seeing people view the community differently. It's the birthplace of GE, celebrating its 125th anniversary as a company. They're looking at opportunities within the community. And the 4-to-1 is, again, extremely restrictive in where we've met all the other criteria. We've taken, we're permitted at 18.5 million gallons a day. We're only running at about 11.8 million. In the last 4 years, through management, where we're reducing the I&I inflow into the system, we've reduced that by about 4 million gallons a day. And if I would be able to...
But having a longer framework than 5 years, the permit's 5 years, I believe, and that setting benchmarks, you can reach that. Are you under being fined during this consent decree or not?
We have not, well, there's always the threat of being fined, but we're, again, working in a manner where we've entered into the consent decree, we've negotiated with it, and trying to remediate the issue and, again, move forward so it's in everybody's best interest, even though the terms are frustrating to try and manage a city on a daily basis.
Yeah. Mr. DeGood, you brought up Cleveland and their challenges of having there since I'm from Ohio. The integrated planning permitting bill, how would that, in your instance, you brought up Cleveland, would that be a benefit to them? Can you expound on that?
Well, I think it's important to note that in the Cleveland example, they signed onto that consent decree in 2011, and the program of projects that they put forward that the EPA agreed to includes a combination of gray and green infrastructure. So I think we're supportive broadly of the concept of integrated planning, but it's not necessary for that legislation to be passed for people to be able to use green infrastructure as part of a consent decree. I think our only concern with the legislation as it's currently drafted is that some of the language comes precariously close to allowing affordability to be a mechanism by which we actually are reducing or weakening the effluent limitations that we would normally put into our NPDES permitting processes. And I think for us, that's probably a break point.
I think my intent is really for the EPA and the local entities, districts to work together to come up with a long-term solution, because the problem you have, they can't charge the ratepayers enough. They can't always do everything at once and give them the flexibility. But if you deliver on a multi-year, long-term plan and set benchmarks and you can get there.
Sure. In the Cleveland example, they signed a 25-year agreement. So I think the EPA was cognizant of the fact that Cleveland had financial restrictions and that the level of improvements that they were asking for were substantial enough that they went ahead and gave them what at the time was one of the longest consent decree implementation windows that had been ever given. So I think the EPA is aware of those challenges that local districts face.
Thanks, Chairman. Time's up.
Thank you. I recognize Ms. Lawrence for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for this opportunity. Thank you all so much, panel. I represent a part of Michigan, and so the Flint water situation was something that was extremely emotional and something that has reconfirmed my commitment to clean water in America and protecting our families and our health through water. Months after warning signs, the water in Flint, Michigan, as you know, did not meet the levels in lead that would be healthy for children. In a city that depended on that. A man-made disaster, it was a tragic outcome. We have found that in September 2016, the U.S. GAO released a study of water infrastructure for selected mid-sized and large cities with declining population, and it was alarming what they found. They found many of them have lost a substantial percent of their population, as you mentioned, Mayor. And because of that, they are seeing declining revenues, which makes it difficult to address the infrastructure needs. And in our investigation of Flint, we found the finance and revenue of maintaining a water system was part of the equation that was used to make a very unfortunate decision. So my question is to you, Mayor McCarthy. In your written statement, you talk about how your city is not atypical, it's older, it's industrial. I know a thing or two about that, being a mayor and myself. Can you talk about the water and infrastructure challenges in cities, because you're here as a U.S. Conference of Mayors, and if any other member want to talk about that, because it's important that as we move forward with the matches that we're talking about, that's a challenge, that we're very clear on investment in water infrastructure is not a luxury or a pretty thing. It is a necessity. So, Mayor, please.
Thank you. The water and wastewater systems are key in terms of basic quality of life, and then also trying to rejuvenate and reinvigorate older communities. You want to be able to attract people there, you want to attract business, and you have to have those systems in place. We want them to maintain and be able to produce the highest quality water, treat wastewater, but the numbers to be able to finance those systems are a lot of times a burden on the community, and it becomes a point where businesses, families, individuals choose to live in other places as opposed to the older urban areas that you have some of the infrastructure in place that really just needs to be upgraded and modernized.
So I know in Flint, and you're saying it too, it's economics, it is housing, and it also builds a community or have an impact on population. But most of all, it is a health component. So some people say quality of life. It's a necessity.
Absolutely.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that? Mr. DeGood, in your written statement, you talk about the need for sound regulations, such as the Clean Water Act, which restores and maintains the chemical and physical integrity. Are the regulations the reason we have a crisis in our water infrastructure in America today?
I think the answer to that is a resounding no. I think we have a crisis of underinvestment that is, in some cases, a shared burden for locals and the federal government. There are certainly places where we can point to where water services are underpriced. And I think rather than trying to point to the regulations that we ask EPA and our state partners to enforce as being the problem, what we need to do is put some additional money on the table. I think what the construction grants program from the original 72 Clean Water Act demonstrates for us is that when the federal government shows up with resources, oftentimes local elected officials find the courage to raise money themselves. Mm-hmm. That is not always the case. There are certainly communities that are so economically challenged that you need to have different matching requirements and an understanding and a sensitivity to that. But those initial construction grants were, for the most part, a 55-45 federal-local match. So our local communities stepped up and did what was asked of them. But I think when you're faced with a bill and somebody's telling you, it's all on you, go ahead and borrow the money, go ahead and do a P3, that's really not the answer.
Thank you. I want to close with this. In America, we're going to start seeing water affordability being an issue in our cities because we have to fund them, we have to provide safe, clean water, and when cities step up to make those investments, they have to get the revenue, and water affordability is going to be an issue we're going to talk about. Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Next is the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a member of the T&I broader committee, but not a member of this subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. Thank you for allowing me to do that. I specifically want to highlight an issue that is important in the district that I represent in Pennsylvania, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Mr. Ellig, this was brought up earlier by Mr. Gibbs, and I appreciate it as well, your testimony in regards to some of the problems with our regulatory process, which produces undesirable results at times. And specifically for our community, the interpretation of the EPA in regards to WOTUS, the Waters of the U.S., and the extension of what is considered Waters of the U.S. is a major problem. This was also briefly mentioned by Mr. Kernion. I was a contractor as well, and so understand the impact on development projects of interpretation of that law. But the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau President, Rick Ebert, noted after President Trump's executive order that virtually all of Pennsylvania's land mass can be claimed by EPA officials as regulated water, subjecting landowners and communities to extreme and needless federal permitting requirements and land use restrictions. These farming groups have also claimed that if they were to dig a drainage ditch on their property, it would potentially become a United States waterway under the WOTUS provisions. This is an example that I think, similar to what you were describing, of an overreach of regulation. So Mr. Ellig, just how is it, if we have a regulation like that in place, how could groups go about trying to find a better balance between the goal that we want to achieve and that overreach?
Well, I understand why this is a difficulty for development, also farmers in Lancaster County. I think we have to go back to basics and insist that our discussions of regulation be based on actual fact and investigation of whether regulations really are likely to create the intended benefits and whether they actually do, after they've been implemented, create the intended benefits. Because unfortunately, an awful lot of the debate over regulation, particularly environmental regulation, has become kind of a holy war where everybody argues over on the basis of their intentions rather than what actually happens as a result of the regulation. So I'd say first things first, let's get back to like factual investigation of what the actual likely results and the actual
Thank you, and completely agree. One of the other points you made, which I thought was very good, you said regulatory agents often act as if enforcement is more important than compliance or achievement of regulatory outcomes. And just recently, farmers in the Chesapeake Bay watershed did a voluntary study and highlighted some of the actions that have already been taken for which they're not recognized. So for instance, 475,800 acres of nutrient manure management, 97,562 acres of enhanced nutrient management, 2,164 animal waste storage units, 2,106 barnyard runoff control systems. You can go on. And the point I want to make is what farmers in my area want to see is more collaboration and less enforcement. Why can we not see that occurring by some of our agencies?
Well, you would get that if agencies were rewarded and individual agencies were rewarded for actually achieving results rather than for achieving outputs or activities that are measurable that may or may not produce results.
And again, the additional point to make is farmers, builders, contractors, the municipalities in my area want to see clean water. They all enjoy clean waters on their farms. They want the Chesapeake to be clean. But again, they want to see more of that collaboration, which I think is sorely missing. So I appreciate your comments. I know we have taken the first step in this regard with the President's executive order, and I know that this is of concern to the chairman of this subcommittee as well, and I look forward to us continuing to work on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lowenthal? We're going to go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Lowenthal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Napolitano. I'm honored to join you as a new member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and the Water Resources and Environmental Subcommittee. I look forward to working together to improve the work of the Army Corps, to protect the Clean Water Act, and to build upon its successes, and that we craft a robust and equitable Water Resources Development Act. I want to thank you for convening this hearing and for the people on the panel for highlighting the importance of water resources and the relevant federal agencies and the role they play in our nation's infrastructure. First question I have is for Mr. DeGood. recent reports, and certainly not, we're not clear yet, but they seem to indicate that President Trump plans to propose devastating cuts to the EPA's funding and staff levels. Several of its most important programs may face elimination altogether. Your testimony and the written testimony highlighted the importance, the enormous importance of the EPA to communities across the country, from protecting clean water infrastructure to safeguarding public health. What do you think that these cuts that we've been at least hearing about to EPA would mean for the federal government's efforts to maintain and improve clean water infrastructure?
So I think I would make 3 points to that question. One, we've had a lot of talk already this morning about frustrations that people have, I think often legitimate, with the length of permitting processes. I think when you're talking about potentially a 30% or greater cut to EPA's budget, you're talking about eliminating many of the positions, many of the people whose job it is to try to review these applications and to provide timely determinations. So if our goal here is to give people greater certainty and to speed those processes up, I don't see how cutting federal staff and federal budgets are going to do that. But I think more importantly, we really undermine our long-term productivity and long-term community health. As just one example, the Section 106 Grants Program provides money directly to states to allow them to do the very implementation work of things like the Clean Water Act, right? This is monitoring, assessing water qualities, developing water quality standards, determining total maximum daily loads, ensuring compliance, taking enforcement actions. This is really the core of laws like the Clean Water Act. We hand off to states to do that work, and when we take money away through EPA budget cuts, we take away their ability to enforce those laws. And the last thing I'll note is about the Brownfields program. These are very productive dollars, and it comes down to a question of efficiency, and it comes down to linear infrastructure. If you allow a parcel that has been polluted over time through a prior industrial use to sit idle, and you go out and you have to build new infrastructure, that's water, that's sewer, that's roads, stoplights, all the things that go along with that to try to attract new housing or new commercial development, you're creating additional facilities that you're going to have to try to maintain for decades into the future. When we remediate parcels that have existing pollution, what we're really doing is creating a pathway for future economic development at that site that will generate tax revenue on top of existing infrastructure. It's not something we have to go out and build new. So we're really cutting off our nose to spite our face when we talk about zeroing out the Brownfields program.
Thank you. Next question, I want to clarify something that I'm not really clear on. Mr. Kernian, you brought up the issue of funding for federal water agencies, and we have heard already of the backlog the Army Corps has for authorized but unconstructed projects, where the valuing is estimated at over $56 billion. Now, you talked about in your written testimony, especially that environmental review processes have played a major role in some of the backlog or holding up the process. But we also heard from the opening statement from Ranking Member DeFazio that the Corps budget cannot deal with the backlog. It's not only, or it's not really the burdensome regulations that are leading to the backlog, but the lack of funding for the Army Corps. Could you kind of deal with this relationship and where you see this relationship between the funding and also the regulations?
Personally, I've seen both. And I'm just speaking offhand. I've worked for as a contractor for the Corps of Engineers now for over 30 years, and I've seen quite a bit of the both take place in waiting on funding. I've seen projects shut down because they didn't have funding, where they've actually gone to contractors and said, look, in order to keep going, you have to finance your project or stop and take the brunt of it until we get more money appropriated for the project. I've also seen the environmental things, which I alluded to when I spoke about before. One of the biggest things that I've seen personally is wetlands issues. Now, maybe EPA issues in other states. Of course, where we are, it just seems like it's more wetlands. Congressman here talked about diverting water. Every time you divert water, it's not opening up another waterway, but, is that water going to go to an area that's now going to become a wetlands, and it's not dryland? It's now drylands, but you run water through it, it might be wet, and then you can't use the land again. So I've seen actually both of them. I don't know if I'm answering your question right, but that's my personal experience with it.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Next, we're going to go to gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Chairman Graves. Congratulations. I had a quick question for you that, I kind of injured my finger on the chair, scooting my chair in earlier. Do you think the Corps could use some investigations money in their account to help me get to the bottom of why you've tried a conspiracy in your first hearing to attack my finger? I mean, this is just outrageous.
I think the Corps would love to investigate that.
Hey, first off, it's great to have Chairman Graves and the Water Committee here, and I appreciate all of the testimony. We're all in the same boat. We all want to see infrastructure built in this country. Mr. Stein, you mentioned that the Mississippi River starts in Minnesota and ends in Louisiana. Well, you know what? It digests through Illinois. And our navigation system and the infrastructure that it needs to continue to keep our navigation system moving from north to south and south to north is right in my district. So it's imperative that we see action. And that's what we haven't seen. 20 years ago, I saw which plan the Corps was going to use to update the locks and dams in the Illinois Upper Miss systems, and we see nothing since then except the plan that they wanted to use. We see no investment. And we've seen from the last administration since 2010 that we've invested nothing in NESP to try and upgrade those antiquated systems. So we've got to have the progress in the middle of your area and his area to ensure that our products get from point A to point B and out into the global marketplace. That being said, Mr. Kernian, great to see you again. We met last night. One of the things that I proposed in the last WRDA bill was to require a GAO study to study alternative models for management of the Inland Waterways Trust Fund, including a possible not-for-profit corporation or government-owned corporation that would actually put us on a path to have a continuous funding source for doing what the Corps of Engineers should do and has done well in the past. That's to build infrastructure and design infrastructure. Seems pretty simple to me. Seems like sometimes over the last few years they may have lost their mission. That being said, you're a builder. What would more certainty, faster project delivery of navigation projects for someone like you, what would that mean to your employees, and what would it mean if we had a continuous funding source that industry could utilize to actually do what the Corps should be doing, build things?
Well, I'm going to answer it like this. I think the Mississippi River, if you look at it as probably, and you compare it to the human body, it's one of the largest arteries, or the largest artery in the body. And at that point, I believe you have to do everything it can to keep that river flowing, keep it from overflowing, and keep commerce up and down that river, because commerce is as important as anything. One of the things talked about is dredging the river deeper to get the Panamax ships into the river. If that was done, we'd actually get more commerce going up and down the river would flow, and it would be a different way to run, goods through that artery. At the same time, the river's treacherous and it's deadly. I've seen the river do some devastating things. I didn't realize water was as dangerous as it could be until I had a levee break years ago. I tried to stop after a hurricane, and it's brutal, what it can do and the damage it can do to people. But also, and what you had alluded to last night, was getting the projects funded for up there. For us, of course, we're 100% behind that. We'd love to see it happen. The more projects up and down the river, we're happy. I was last year's president of Mississippi River Valleys Associated General Contractors, and a lot of the contractors in our district work on that river, and they depend on getting the funding to build that infrastructure.
Well, a lot of the contractors in my district work on that river, and you're absolutely right. We've got to have some movement, and I don't have much time left, and I know the chairman, he's not going to give me any extra time. So I want to make sure the witnesses know my opinion. I think a body resembling the Inland Waterway Users Board, and including other key stakeholders like many of you at this table, including government representation, like the Corps of Engineers, would do a much more efficient job of identifying a project schedule and making expenditures to priority projects that have already received approval from Congress. After all, you guys are the people paying for the projects, right? Let's actually make sure they get done. And with that, I've got about 2 seconds left, and I'm going to yield it back, Mr. Chairman.
It's impressive efficiency. Thank you, Mr. Davis. With that, we're going to yield to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. Etzi.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Napolitano, and thank you to the entire panel. Many of us are bouncing between committees. I've got all three of mine going simultaneously at this hour. A couple of quick comments to Mr. Stein. Greetings from my husband, former Commissioner of DEEP in Connecticut, and thanks for the good work EGOS does and having grown up in part in Winona. To Mr. Kiernan, father and grandfather, both AGC contractors, and my grandfather built locks and dams on the Mississippi River, so some experience with that. To Mr. Inami, grew up in Northern California in part, very familiar with the Feather River and challenges there. So to Mr. Ellig, I want you to know that there's support on both sides of the aisle for focusing on technology and outcomes. And I think it's vitally important with constrained budgets, having been a local town council member, state representative, and now in Congress, we've got to figure out how to be faster and more efficient. And I appreciate you flagging time as a real cost. And that's something we really need to focus on, and I think we need to streamline our systems and get better outcomes with less time and free up those resources to actually be spent on getting the outcomes. I wanted to turn to the issue of brownfields, and I think Mr. Katko is going to join me on that. We have legislation we're putting back in this Congress. We need funding, and to really focus on the vital importance of that and rebuilding communities. And it's actually related to some of the issues Ms. Pape raised too. If we don't get the funding in those communities, and I represent Connecticut, I've got cities like Waterbury, Connecticut, which has major parcels of land right in the middle of downtown. If we don't rehab those, we're not going to be able to create jobs. We're going to be chewing up farmland elsewhere, so it's bad for the ecology of other communities, and frankly, we're not going to have the jobs. So I'd like, if you could, Mayor, if you can talk a little bit about how important brownfields are for revitalization of our communities and which of the grants that are most important to you, because again, if we're looking at a 25% or anything like that kind of cut, we're going to be really challenged in figuring out how to work through that backlog on brownfields.
Thank you. Brownfields, as you point out, they're underutilized, they're a negative influence on communities, and they have largely a proud history. There was something there at one time that added value. For whatever reason, it's no longer there. And so you have to have the tenacity and the systematic approach to work through whatever the problems may be. And a lot of times, people they think that you can't solve the problem, but you can, and it requires the partnership at state, local, federal level, the private sector to come up to do the evaluation, to look at the opportunities that are there, to create real value. And so that the funding from the federal level is key in driving that overall discussion and the partnerships that can form if the funding mechanism is in place.
We'd love to cycle back with you on some specific proposals we were looking at to include P3s and other ways of leveraging those resources, whether it's for parks, which are part of creating that quality of life, or repurposed industrial sites, or shopping malls, or whatever it may be. We're trying to put some urban greenhouses in one of ours to bring food back into the city, cap those sites, but then actually repurpose them for use. Mr. Good, you talked a little bit about that. Can you speak both about brownfields and the importance of that, and also return a little bit to the importance of leveraging that federal funding, because I saw it at the local level. If communities don't have those match for water systems, they can't get the goodwill of local residents to raise the property tax to pay for those projects.
I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the hardest things as an elected official is when somebody tells you that it's your responsibility and your responsibility alone. And it's a hard thing to go out into your community even if you passionately believe in the value of something like the Clean Water Act or the flood control standards that the Army Corps has, even if you want to try to engage in redevelopment, if you're saying, we're on our own here. And so that's why when we start hearing stories about the kinds of budget cuts that this administration is contemplating for the Environmental Protection Agency, it's disheartening, because we know that ultimately, for an administration that has spent so much time talking about jobs, taking these dollars out are actually going to do just the opposite. It's going to take the stick out of local elected officials' hands and make them unable to deliver for their communities.
I see my time's expiring, so I'm going to yield back my 5 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Esty. With that, we're going to turn to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your chairmanship. I look forward to working on this committee. Mr. McCarthy, welcome, and I appreciate your testimony thus far. As you may or may not know, I'm from upstate New York in Syracuse and spent a lot of time in Schenectady. And in so doing, it led me to the conclusion that Schenectady is very much in the same boat of all the upstate New York cities. We've lost tremendous amounts of manufacturing and tremendous amounts of tax base over the last several decades, and that's led to profound infrastructure problems, which I'm not quite certain that we've delved into it with enough detail, and that's what I want to do for the next few minutes. As you may or may not know, in Syracuse, we have such a profound problem with our water infrastructure that some of the pipes we use in the city of Syracuse are still wooden from like the late 1800s, early 1900s, which is unbelievable to me. Last year, we had well over 100 water main breaks in the city of Syracuse, and some of the really up-and-coming areas like Armory Square were often peppered with backhoes digging up lines and fixing them, and water problems. And it just seems, in this day and age, that's crazy. With that as a backdrop, if you could describe for me, the state of your water infrastructure, and then I have some follow-up questions from there.
Schenectady is fortunate for its water supply. We get from the Great Flats Aquifer, the recharge, the Mohawk River. And so we have a high-quality, really low-cost source of water.
Same in Syracuse, yes.
Again, it's one of the great things about upstate New York. Now, at the same time, as you point out, we have infrastructure that was put in place 100 years ago, 125 years ago, sometimes longer. And it just has a realistic lifespan. And so you have to be able to manage those resources. And without, you hope that those pipes are going to last another 50 years. The reality is they're not going to. And the ability to predict when something happens is unfortunate. It's just that element of randomness, so that you're dealing with a major break in a water line or sewer line, and it's always occurring at 2 o'clock in the morning on a weekend, and you're having to mobilize crews that would be normally doing other things. But if we can get ahead of that problem, those cities in upstate New York and they're mirrored across the country have long distinguished histories of significant economic outputs, centers of innovation, technology, and you want to have that water and sewer system in place so that we can position the communities for really that next generation of innovation and evolution of urban life.
Right, and I totally agree with you. And from an industry standpoint, I can only note that we really have a limitless supply of water between Lake Ontario, the Finger Lakes. It's just amazing in upstate New York that the quality of water that we have is consistently some of the best in the country, and we don't have systems to deliver it. So how do you, in your mind, assess the adequacy of the funding to fix these projects, and what would you suggest we try to do from a legislative standpoint?
Schenectady, we've largely dealt with it ourselves, even though we've had some assistance from the state, some assistance from some federal money in the funding streams. But Schenectady gets referenced continually as having one of the highest tax rates, not only in New York State, but in the country. And it's because we're paying for those things, and it's not only water and sewer, but it's other roads, school district, other community assets, and you get to the point where even though you're trying to keep up and keep ahead of the curve, it creates a negative influence where it in fact deters our ability to attract residents, to attract business, to play on the assets of the water and other natural resources that exist not only within Schenectady, but in upstate New York.
Right, so I understand the problem, but how would you fix it? What would you think we need to do?
I would like a funding formula that has participation at all levels, so that you have federal money, there's state money, there's local money. Some of the highway and bridge money, it's a good formula. It's 80% federal, 15% state, and then 5% local.
Well, how about the Clean Water Revolving Fund? Is that a fund you can access, and if you can, is that adequate for the job?
We have found it adequate because, again, we've had low cost for our water source. I'm not sure that is shared by other communities across the country, and I don't have some of that information directly available, but we'll have it forwarded to you to conclusion at today's hearing.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Katko. And with that, we're going to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Graves, thank you. Congratulations. Ranking Member Napolitano and what's left of the committee. Just a couple of comments before I ask a question. Mike Inami is here. He faced a most difficult situation over the last month when the floods occurred in California, when the Oroville Dam spillway failed and releasing an extraordinary amount of water down the Feather River through his responsible area on the west side of the Feather River and the community of Yuba City, causing the failure of the spillway caused a mass evacuation of over almost 200,000 people, of which about 100,000 of those were in the community that he was trying to protect by flood fighting, an extraordinary piece of work. Fighting the flood while everybody was leaving town, and I know you and your crews did not leave town. You stayed there and fought the flood, even though you might have been under 20 feet of water had that spillway actually failed. That is, the emergency spillway actually failed. Within 7 hours, you would be under 20 feet of water. Courageous, necessary. One of the major, as I understand it, Mr. Nami, is that the one of the significant flood fight areas, that is a levee that was failing, was to become part of a Corps of Engineers project, but had not yet been designated in the New Start programs that we receive occasionally from the Corps of Engineers. My point here is if that particular 1 mile stretch of the levee, I think there was two stretches actually, had been designated in the 2017 work plan, would you have been fighting floods?
There's really two parts to respond to that question, and it gets back to my earlier comments about how flood control projects are repaired or improved, and it is that we collaborate with the Corps of Engineers to get New Start designations, new projects constructed by the Corps. And in fact, that reach of critically deficient levee has been a source of a couple of failures, protects 20,000 people just by itself, was part of the federal project authorized by Congress in 2014. But through the state of California, for these critically damaged sites, we can't wait. And so we applied, while we're working with the Corps in the Civil Works process, we worked through the Corps of Engineers under the 408 process and use our own money and just do it ahead of time. Well, under that circumstance, in fact, we had applied to repair that reach of levee or a portion of that critically damaged reach of levee last year. We were lined up to do it last year, and because of some cultural resource issues, we had to go through a second 45-day review period through the 408 process. Rather extraordinary. As a result, killed our construction season. Fast forward to last month, we're flood fighting that reach that would have normally have been repaired under a normal construction season. That's money out of our pockets. We're hopeful that the state will reimburse us at the end of the day, and that was work that could have been done in a normal construction season.
I think the point I want to make here is that there are all kinds of projects. There are the nice to-do projects. There are the necessary projects, and then there are those projects upon which human life depends. And in this case, these levee improvements, there are known levee weaknesses. It's not just in my district, although I have 1,100 miles of levees. But around the nation, there are known weaknesses in levees upon which human life is at risk. And we ought to be prioritizing, nice to, necessary, economic development or whatever, and then life-threatening. And we should urge the Corps of Engineers in the process that we've now established where they come to us with their proposed projects, that we keep in mind the life-threatening projects. And so I have more than enough in my district, but I suspect that the members of Congress, some of whom are still at this committee hearing, have similar necessary to preserve human life projects. I'm going to be out of time in 6 seconds, but I want to really congratulate Mike, you and the work you've done. You've taken more than 40 miles of levee. You've upgraded those 40 miles of levee in a very rapid process. Had you not done that, surely, even without the failure of the emergency spillway, there would have been lives lost had you not been on top of these projects over the last several years. Congratulations to you, and thank you for that effort, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. Next, we're going to go to the vice chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Mass from Florida. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and each of you for your testimony today. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed reading them. Number one, I live in one of those areas, very similar issues as so many here, issues with the Corps of Engineers, issues with the infrastructure that's going on. My community, personally, it's regularly plagued by massively harmful discharges coming out of Lake Okeechobee and going out towards the east coast and west coast of Florida. They're implemented by the Corps of Engineers. Sometimes these discharges of fresh water into our saltwater estuaries are as high as 7 million gallons a minute at their peak flows. It's very devastating. We get just absolutely devastating algae blooms. And again, probably the most disconcerting part to me is that these are imposed by the federal government on us, but they're not cleaned up by the federal government. And that's one of the worst things that I could say about them. Now, one of the other things that we could say about this is just fresh water that's simply lost out to sea. And as we look at each of our areas across the country where we see some people that don't have enough water, and as was said before, some of us that have way too much water, it can become very troublesome and very frustrating to all of us. And that's just as an aside here. Now, from my vantage point, one of the best ways to ensure that water is utilized in a beneficial way instead of being wastefully discharged is for the Corps of Engineers, in many of these cases, to marry their flood control efforts and that mission with their ecological restoration mission that they have in so many places. For my area, it's marrying the flood control of the dikes surrounding Lake Okeechobee with the ecological restoration that's south of Lake Okeechobee that feeds into the Florida Bay and the Florida Everglades. And that means in order for them to get this done in a timely way, which hasn't happened in my area, tackling what we're talking about today, these burdensome regulatory problems, construction issues, funding delays that are just slowing the Corps of Engineers from completing projects. In my area, the Herbert Hoover Dike rehabilitation, 60-plus projects. When they don't get done, it really adds up. So what I really want to ask you all, this kind of, to me, is Exhibit A of how there can be otherwise well-intentioned rules and regulations that exist out there, but they actually end up hurting our communities and impeding environmental protection and impeding the progress of infrastructure. So with that in mind, I was particularly struck by your testimony, Mr. Kernian, when you said a couple of things. One, in order to build a 21st century infrastructure, we have to build it sometime this century, and I think that's a very important thing to say. But more specifically, when you talked about the Port of Savannah going through a 14-year environmental review process, 14 years, and a 30-year to completion process. So in that being your testimony, I wanted to ask you two specific things. One, can you pinpoint one specific thing, the biggest bang for your buck? This is what we do to enable this infrastructure to be completed, to, you know, which piece of it do we get out of the way? What's your number one piece to enabling this, to get things done?
You make sure your microphone's on, please.
Button. I said this earlier, the biggest thing that I've seen is the, like a better way to say it, red tape with the environmental procedures and approvals to get projects moving forward.
No, you listed in your testimony a number of, you know, you listed wildlife, EPA, NOAA, and a number of others. Can you point to one specifically?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things, and I'll give you an example. If we're building a levee and there's a tree in the way and it's got an eagle in the top of the tree, that levee's going to be moved. They buy houses, something's going to happen. Now, I'm not doing everything against eagles. I think they're great, but it costs a lot of dollars to move it, you know, and rather to go ask the guy if he can fly to another tree. But and I'm not trying to be funny about it, but I see some things that are really get to be like major impacts to what we do. That's all, and it's in the environmental things more so than anything. Indecisiveness, yeah, big issue there, but a lot of the environmental red tape on some things that are really, you know, they shouldn't happen. That's all.
Okay. I have another question for you. I got a couple more seconds here, and that's this. I get an answer often from the Corps of Engineers when I talk about timelines for getting things done, that there's simply not enough manpower, not enough qualified crews to go out there and get some of the projects done, specifically in my area around Lake Okeechobee that the Corps of Engineers is conducting. Can you speak to whether you think that's an accurate assessment? Is there enough crews out there to go out there and complete things in a faster way? Do you guys have the manpower as general contractors, construction contractors?
Do the contractors or does the Corps?
The contractors.
Corps of Engineers, General Van Antwerp years ago asked us after Katrina if the contractors had the manpower to put it in place, all of the restoration efforts, and contractors stepped up to the plate and got it done. Corps of Engineers stepped up to the plate and got it done also. One of the things that I do not know is I've never worked personally with that district around Lake Okeechobee. I've heard some rumors about guys that have worked with them, and I'll refrain from comment on that, what I've heard, but it's a different district. And when you work for the Corps of Engineers in different districts, they operate totally different. You know, we did FEMA trailers on a Corps contract after this most recent flood up in around Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and they had one of the districts, I think it was in northern Alabama, came down. Totally different ball game than working with the New Orleans district. I mean, totally different. Some of it was shocking, what we'd have to go through, be quite honest with you. But I've never worked with the people in your area to be able to really comment on that much as far as the Corps then. But the contractors, I think contractors can come up to the plate and make it happen.
Okay. My time has expired, so I thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Mass. I'm going to go to the ranking member, Mr. Napolitano.
Just the last one before we let you go. Mr. DeGood, if the president were to put forward a proposal that privatized leveraged private equity capital as the primary federal role addressing water infrastructure projects, what would be the likely impact to communities like mine or anybody else's, where local ratepayers already having a difficult time making ends meet in addressing the water quality in their area? And the second question, I'll make it quick, I want to get over with. You described a recent trend for local communities to take on more debt to address local water challenges, yet often the communities have insufficient tax and user fee revenues to cover these debts. I strongly believe they want clean water just like anybody else, but often have competing needs for municipal service, fire and police, that need to be addressed. And the solutions for this change would be what? How can the federal government play in this?
Right. I think it's important to understand that private equity, even with the presence of the tax credits that President Trump and some of his team have talked about, would have very little value for many communities. If you are already struggling to find the financial resources to repay municipal bonds, at 3% or 3.5%, it's unlikely that you're going to magically have the resources to be able to cover the return on private equity that can be anywhere from 10 to 18%, depending on the project. And again, even with the presence of tax credits bringing down the cost of that equity somewhat, it's still going to be a stretch for communities. And I think one of the things that I have found that is troubling about some of the public-private partnerships that have happened in recent years is the extent to which local communities are paying the premium price that goes along with a P3, but not receiving some of the benefits that we normally associate with this form of procurement. Specifically, if we compare this to the transportation side, we see that there is more of an opportunity for true risk transference, especially for projects that may exceed $1 billion or $1.5 billion. But when we're talking about smaller systems where the only infrastructure upgrades that are contemplated as part of these capital improvement programs are basic repairs and rehabilitation, replacing of pump stations, we can't really honestly say that that private sector contractor is taking on this risk payment because of the complexity of the work. Again, some of these contracts have the public maintaining complete liability for any environmental discharges that violate federal or state laws. They have the public on the hook for any rate increases for the water deliveries they may take for regional drinking water providers. They have the public on the hook for any cost overruns in the infrastructure projects that they have in their capital plan. So to my mind, it's troubling for us to say to local communities, don't worry, you can always go out, take equity capital, take these tax credits from the Trump administration, and that's going to solve your problem. It just really isn't.
Anybody else? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Pape, I'm curious if you would care to respond to Mr. DeGood's comments.
I would. I can't speak to a lease form of private equity investment, but I can speak to acquisition of assets by a private entity. And in that case, in many instances, we can spread those costs because we have a larger base. It's a very capital-intensive industry. We also take on all risk. We don't leave risk with the community. We take it on, not only for the assets that we're buying, but for upgrading. And asset renewal is an ongoing effort. It's not a once and done. It's every day, every year, you're continually looking at what needs to be replaced, what condition do you have. So in terms of the private companies that buy assets, we do assume the risk, and we are able to spread out the costs as well, so the impact on the customers is not as great.
Great, thank you. I will tell you, I have a number of other questions for all of you. You've been patiently sitting there for 2 hours, and we are most appreciative. We are going to have, I think, a number of questions for the record for each of you. I just want to say in closing, I'm going to go back to home, and Mr. Kernians from Louisiana. He made mention in his testimony about a situation at home where we have an eroding coast. We've lost approximately 2,000 square miles of our coast, wetlands. And we're all familiar with how important wetlands are, and we're familiar with the Clean Water Act and 404 permits and things along those lines. Well, the primary cause of this wetlands loss in the state of Louisiana is actually the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And it's interesting to see this kind of the irony in the regulatory program, in that they're making everyone else protect wetlands and restore wetlands and mitigate wetlands, yet in the case when their own actions cause loss, they literally are doing nothing. And not only doing nothing, but in fact impeding efforts, as was noted, by the state and others in some cases to actually restore wetlands. And so, look, this isn't a partisan issue. This is something that all of us need to be working very closely together on. I'll make note. The administration, again, announced that they intend to pursue a $1 trillion infrastructure package. We have a project in South Louisiana called the Morganza the Gulf Hurricane Protection Project that's been in the study phase since 1992. The federal government has not stuck a shovel in the ground. We have a hurricane protection project in Louisiana called the West Shore Project. The project just came out of the study phase, and thankfully the committee authorized the project in the WRDA bill, but it was in the study phase for approximately 42 years before, I want to be clear, before a project recommendation was made right? So not a single thing's been done, just a project recommendation. We heard Mr. Note that in his case, when he carried out the project on his own, that he was able to do it for approximately half the cost. So this isn't anything to beat up on anyone. This isn't a partisan issue. This is all about the fact that we have limited resources, and many of you in your testimony talked about the need for greater investment. Well, one of the ways you get greater investment is by stretching your dollar, by ensuring that you are most efficiently using the resources that you have. If you can carry out a project for half the cost, you can do 2 of them. It's a simple concept and something that I think we need to be paying careful attention to, the amount of money that we're spending on administrative, on regulatory compliance, and on project implementation to ensure that we can sit here and tell taxpayers that we're maximizing the limited resources that are available. With that, I again want to thank all the witnesses. You can expect questions for the record that we'll be submitting and ask for your response to those. Thanks again. It has been very helpful. And if no other members have anything to add, the committee stands adjourned.